What if the most powerful country on Earth is spending billions, but still feels outmatched? Every year, all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, from the CIA to the NSA, sit down and write a single document. It's the annual Director of National Intelligence Threat Assessment. This report isn't just paperwork. It's what Congress uses to decide how much to spend on the military. It's what's quoted to justify new sanctions or build new bases. But what's truly surprising isn't what it says about Russia. It's what it admits about America. Let's look at the facts the report lays bare. Russia controls nearly half the Arctic coastline. They have over 40 icebreakers, 8 of them nuclear-powered, and a next-generation super icebreaker coming online by 2030. And this isn't Russian propaganda or a minister's speech. It's the U.S. itself, after spending months analyzing satellite images and classified intelligence, openly stating, in the Arctic, Russia holds all the cards. Now, contrast that with the U.S. The world's second-largest economy, with a military budget greater than the next 10 countries combined, doesn't have a single heavy icebreaker in active service. The only one they have was launched back in the 1970s and is pushing 50 years old. While Russia keeps expanding its lead, building new nuclear icebreakers with no global equals, the U.S. is left on the sidelines. And these aren't empty statistics. Decades of investment and experience are at play, and Washington's own intelligence community is the one ringing the alarm bell. But here's the real twist. All this is written not by Russia, but by those who see Russia as the primary adversary. And these admissions don't come out of nowhere. Every number, every alarming paragraph serves a purpose: to shape military budgets, to fuel new arms programs, to convince Congress and the public that more spending is urgently needed. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we ignore what's really being admitted here about both Russia's strengths and America's vulnerabilities, we risk pouring billions into the wrong priorities and misunderstanding who truly holds power over strategic regions, trade routes, and crucial technologies. So, what's really inside this threat assessment? Why is it being published now, and what does it reveal not just about Russia, but about evolving U.S. strategy and anxiety? Let's break it down, number by number, and see why the timing and content of this report matter more than ever. Every year, a secret document shapes billions in military spending. What's its real agenda? It's called the Annual Threat Assessment, and it's not just a dry list of dangers lurking out in the world. This is a report meticulously crafted by the combined brainpower of 18 U.S. intelligence agencies. Yes, all of them, from the CIA to the NSA. Its official purpose? To brief Congress on global threats and help steer America's security decisions. But if you think it's simply about informing lawmakers, think again. This document is the script that sets the stage for America's defense policy, military budgets, and even the next wave of sanctions and overseas deployments. Before any funding bill is passed, before any new missile shield gets built, Congress and the public are presented with this report. Its warnings are designed to sound as convincing and as urgent as possible. Then, the administration rolls out a program to address the newly spotlighted threat. Who could possibly vote against fortifying the country when every intelligence chief is telling you the danger is both real and growing? This is not a conspiracy theory. It's almost spelled out in the report itself. The assessment openly admits that it legitimizes the next cycle of military modernization. It's right there, in almost plain language. Take the most recent example. The 2024 assessment lands at a crucial political moment, when new missile defense projects and appropriations are on the table. The report doesn't just highlight abstract threats, it singles out Russia's growing power in the Arctic as the major concern. Detailed descriptions of Russia's expanding icebreaker fleet, its nuclear assets, and its Arctic military infrastructure dominate the pages. Suddenly, the conversation in Washington isn't about past missteps or outdated systems, but about why more money is needed to keep up with the new Red Arctic challenge. But here's the real trick. By focusing on the swelling Russian threat, the report does double duty. Inside the Beltway, it justifies a bigger defense budget, hundreds of billions for new weapons, new bases, and new surveillance programs. On the world stage, it reinforces the official portrayal of Russia not as a complex rival, but as an existential adversary. That's the narrative that makes it easier to expand NATO's footprint, to build new outposts along Russia's borders, and to roll out entire packages of sanctions, all with a single, authoritative report as political cover. It's elegant, if you think about it. One document, two results. At home, it's the argument for more money. Abroad, it's the pretext for more pressure. Here's why you should care. If we take this report only at face value, if we accept it as pure, unbiased intelligence, we miss the deeper story of how public narratives are constructed to secure funding and political support. We miss how America's own vulnerabilities and anxieties are woven right into the warning. So, what exactly does this year's threat assessment say about Russia? And what does it really reveal about the shifting balance of power in the Arctic and beyond? Let's peel back the layers and look past the headlines. How did Russia quietly pull ahead, while the US, with the biggest military budget in the world, lags behind in one of the planet's most strategic regions? To find the answer, you just have to look north, way north, to the Arctic. Here's what the US intelligence assessment admits, almost grudgingly. Russia controls nearly half the Arctic's coastline. Their icebreaker fleet is unmatched, 42 vessels in total, including 8 nuclear-powered behemoths. And right now, Russia is building yet another atomic icebreaker, bigger and more powerful than anything else afloat. Compare that to the US, which has just one heavy icebreaker, and it's been in service for almost 5 decades. That's not just a gap, it's a chasm. But this didn't happen overnight, or by chance. Russia's dominance in the Arctic is the result of decades of investment, planning, technological development, and sheer experience operating in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. They've put in the work, building infrastructure, establishing bases, and mastering the logistics of Arctic navigation. The US, by contrast, is playing catch-up with limited tools, outdated ships, and an urgent lack of infrastructure and trained personnel. The intelligence report doesn't hide this. In fact, it underlines America's lack of physical presence and practical expertise in the region, almost as a plea. Now, why does this matter? The stakes in the Arctic aren't just about bragging rights. They're about who controls access to vast untapped resources, future trade routes, and crucial military positions. The Northern Sea Route, hugging Russia's coast, could soon become the world's next great shipping corridor, connecting Asia and Europe far faster than the Suez Canal ever could. And it would be under the watchful eye and military protection of Russia's Navy and Coast Guard, using Russian ports, Russian infrastructure, and Russian power. This is no mere hypothetical. The report spells out a scenario that keeps US strategists up at night. Imagine Chinese cargo ships bypassing the Suez, moving goods from Asia to Europe along the Russian Arctic coast, shielded by joint Russian-Chinese patrols. China, which now calls itself a near-Arctic state, despite being far from the polar circle, is eager to invest in this so-called Polar Silk Road, integrating it into its global Belt and Road initiative. Russia, in turn, opens the door for Chinese capital, technology, and global leverage. That's a strategic alliance in the making, combining Russian resources, Arctic know-how, and China's industrial might. For the US, which has relied for generations on controlling global sea lanes, this is a nightmare scenario. Control trade logistics, and you control commerce. Control commerce, and you shape the world economy. And suddenly, Washington finds its monopoly slipping. The intelligence report doesn't just warn about Russian rockets or nuclear submarines. It's laser-focused on the combined weight of Russian and Chinese cooperation. Sanctions, military drills, diplomatic pressure, these are listed as US tools. But none of them can replicate what Russia already has: boots on the ice, ships in the water, and allies ready to invest. Congress, of course, seizes on these findings. The narrative of Russian, and now Russian-Chinese advantage in the Arctic becomes justification for ballooning budgets. Projects like the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system are pitched as essential to close the gap, to regain the initiative. But the report quietly admits, no amount of money can conjure up Arctic infrastructure overnight. You can't build a military base above the polar circle in a single budget cycle. Russia already has them, and China is ready to help expand them. Here's the risk. If the US and its allies downplay or ignore these imbalances, the consequences won't just be shifts on a map. There's a real threat of losing access to Arctic resources, being sidelined from new shipping routes, and forfeiting strategic military leverage. That could cost the US and the West not just money, but long-term security and global influence, a price tag no one wants to pay. But the Arctic isn't the whole story. As we'll see next, it's just one front in a much larger global chess match, where Russia's strategy and America's vulnerabilities are coming into focus on an even bigger stage. What if the real threat isn't just Russia, but who might join them? That's the question haunting America's latest intelligence threat assessment. And it's not just about nukes or tanks. The real anxiety is about shifting alliances, new playbooks, and the prospect of Russia and China joining forces in places that really matter, like the Arctic. Because while Washington has long been obsessed with counting missiles, the new front lines are icy waters, digital highways, and choke points where trade, data, and military power all intersect. Let's break this down. The report zeroes in on a dawning partnership between Russia and China in the Arctic, a region that, until recently, most people only thought about in terms of melting ice caps or polar bears. But here's the thing. For Moscow and Beijing, the Arctic is the new global crossroads. Russia brings military muscle and a permanent presence north of the Arctic Circle. Bases, icebreakers, hypersonic missile platforms. China, meanwhile, comes with cash, tech, and long-term ambition. Beijing now calls itself a near-Arctic state and is sinking billions into the so-called Polar Silk Road with one goal, to shortcut Asian and European trade through the Northern Sea route, bypassing Western-controlled shipping lanes. Imagine what happens if that dream becomes reality. If Russian and Chinese control over Arctic logistics grows, they could rewire global trade, diverting billions in shipping away from US-influenced routes like the Suez or Panama canals. That's not just about lost tolls. It's about who gets to set the rules, who collects the data, and who can move military assets quickly between continents. The US, for all its exercises and sanctions, doesn't have the same boots-on-the-ice presence up north. The intelligence report admits it. American options rely on diplomacy, sanctions, and periodic show-of-force drills, but Russia is already there, dug in, year-round. It's not just about the Arctic. The report forecasts a drastic jump in missile threats by 2025, lumping together Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and even Pakistan. The numbers are meant to shock. Tens of thousands of potential threats, from high-precision hypersonics to cheap swarming drones. The logic is brutal. Overload any future American defense system not with 1 or 10 missiles, but with 100 at once. And here's the real kicker. This isn't just fear-mongering for its own sake. It's a way for US intelligence agencies to say, in not so many words, our defenses were built for a different era. The world changed. Now it's time to pay up, upgrade, adapt, or get left behind. This is where the political calculus comes in. By aggregating all these threats, the report makes the defense budget increases sound not just reasonable, but essential. Yet beneath the drama is a quiet admission. US missile defense was designed for single launches, not mass barrages or new-generation weapons. In other words, the system is overdue for a makeover, by about 30 years, according to the report's subtext. But here's why it matters, for Washington and for everyone else. If US policymakers and allies underestimate what a Russia-China alignment really means, they risk more than just embarrassment. They could actually lose control over critical trade arteries, military corridors, and technological standards. And that's not something you fix with a bigger budget alone. It means ceding real influence, economically, militarily, and diplomatically, to rivals who are playing a long game and, increasingly, playing it together. And as the report details, this isn't just a hypothetical. Russia is now a global actor, operating simultaneously in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Arctic. Each new region where Moscow plants a flag, Washington is forced to respond, rebuilding influence in Africa, recalculating every oil deal in the Middle East, convincing European allies to spend more on defense. The narrative frames this as chaos, as hybrid warfare, as instability. But if you read between the lines, it's a grudging recognition that Russia, with or without China, has mastered the art of doing more with less, achieving real results without trillion-dollar budgets. That's the real echo in the halls of U.S. intelligence. As Russia and China deepen their partnership, the cost of countering them rises, not just in dollars, but in influence lost, rules rewritten, and opportunities missed. And most strikingly, the very threat assessment meant to justify spending actually reveals the extent of the challenge and America's vulnerabilities. But there's more. The report also admits how Russia's global presence and technological innovations force the U.S. to stretch, spend, and adapt on multiple continents at once. Real strength isn't always measured by budgets or headlines. It's in focus and adaptability. And as we dig into this intelligence report, that's exactly what begins to stand out. The difference between simply spending more and actually concentrating power where it matters. Let's take a step back. The U.S. report paints Russia as an actor able to project military and political power, not just in Europe, but all the way from the Arctic, through the Middle East, and into Africa. For every new region where Russia shows up, Washington is forced to spread its resources even thinner. Each move requires more money, more personnel, and more attention, stretching existing alliances and draining national budgets. The report labels Russian activity as destabilizing, but if you read between the lines, that's actually an admission. Moscow's presence is significant enough to force a reaction. This dynamic is about more than just tanks or warships. The Arctic, for example, is a region where Russia has nearly half the northern coastline, over 40 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear-powered, and a string of new bases. It's modernizing its nuclear arsenal, with the Kola Peninsula alone hosting 2/3 of its second-strike nuclear capability and a fleet of strategic submarines. The report notes that Russia is combining advanced and mass-delivery missile systems designed to overwhelm any foreseeable missile defense, investing in infrastructure that's not just visible, but deeply strategic. Meanwhile, the U.S., despite spending more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, is openly documenting its own overstretch. The report talks about dispersing resources over dozens of conflicts, about the pressure of internal security, and about the fear of Russia and China coordinating in key regions. These aren't assessments from some outside critic. This is American intelligence in a report meant for Congress. Just think about that. The richest, best-funded military in history, admitting to anxiety and overload, not as a sign of weakness, but as a diagnosis, an institutional reality. Every new front, Pacific, Middle East, Europe, Africa, makes the U.S. presence thinner, and the intelligence community can't hide it. In fact, they have to make it clear in order to justify the next round of budget increases. There's a striking contrast here. Russia, facing sanctions, economic pressure, and a much smaller budget, is described as acting in multiple key regions, building up the Arctic, modernizing its nuclear shield, and developing new weapons. The U.S., with many times the resources, complains of running thin. Both of these descriptions sit side by side in the same report. The irony is hard to ignore. Whether the authors see it or not, to get funding, they have to admit to vulnerabilities that adversaries can read just as clearly. But there's another dimension: technology. The report makes it crystal clear: control over advanced chips, artificial intelligence, and quantum encryption is the new front line. Export controls and restrictions on these technologies are no longer a short-term sanction or a response to a specific event. They're a long-term strategy, designed to shape the next decade or more, echoing Cold War-era controls over uranium and missile tech. Now, chips are in the same league as warheads, not metaphorically, but as a core part of American strategy. Here's the catch. While Russia isn't named as a leader in AI or quantum computing, it's listed among the states whose access to top-tier chips, AI solutions, and cutting-edge encryption must be maximally restricted. And the word maximal in an intelligence report is never accidental. This isn't about temporary measures. It signals a generational struggle over technology. The lesson from history, though, is sobering. The US spent decades trying to control nuclear and missile technology, yet Russia still built one of the world's most formidable nuclear forces. The same could play out with chips and AI. When a state decides a technology is critical for survival, it usually finds a way, sooner or later. The intelligence community knows this. They document the strategy of containment, but they don't guarantee its success. The report almost reluctantly admits, America is now playing defense, not from a position of unchallenged superiority, but from a fear of losing what advantage remains. That's a fundamental shift. True leaders don't talk about building fences to keep the competition out. They just lead. When the discussion turns to restrictions and controls, it's a sign that open competition may no longer feel like a sure win. And here's the practical takeaway. The report, drafted to outline threats to the United States, ends up revealing just as much about American vulnerabilities. It lists the overload of security priorities, the stretching of resources across dozens of theaters, and anxiety over Russian and Chinese collaboration. These aren't just admissions, they're signals to anyone paying attention. When you try to be everywhere at once, you end up being strong nowhere. When you know your priorities, the Arctic, nuclear deterrence, key regions, you can focus, and that focus is a force multiplier. Ignoring these dynamics is risky. Overconfidence, wasted money, and dangerous misreading of the real balance of power can all stem from believing your own mythology. Those who recognize the signals, whether policymakers, businesses, or citizens, are the ones who will have an edge as the global landscape shifts. So, taking all of this together, what does this intelligence assessment really tell us about where power is moving, and what should we take away from these admissions and strategies? Let's bring the whole picture into focus. When a superpower admits its own fears, are we looking at a warning or a confession? This is the real question left hanging after reading the latest U.S. intelligence threat assessment. On the one hand, the report catalogs Russia's growing reach, upgrading nuclear deterrence, expanding Arctic infrastructure, fielding 42 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear-powered, and securing strategic footholds from Europe to Africa. The Kola Peninsula alone holds 2/3 of Russia's second-strike nuclear capacity, supported by 7 strategic submarines. In the Arctic, Washington calls a Russia-China partnership a nightmare scenario, and that's not a label you throw around lightly. These details aren't editorial spin. They're direct from the 18 agencies responsible for briefing Congress. But the real twist comes in what the report admits about the U.S. itself. Despite having a military budget that dwarfs Russia's many times over, the U.S. describes its own situation with striking candor. Resource shortfalls, overstretch, and a kind of institutional fatigue. There's open concern about being unable to match Russia's regional focus, especially in the Arctic, where America lacks an icebreaker fleet and depends heavily on allies, who themselves are buckling under the financial weight of American-led decisions. The assessment goes so far as to confess a 30-year lag in missile defense, now being frantically patched with expensive, unproven technologies. Technological containment is presented more as a gamble than a guarantee, a desperate effort to hold back a shifting balance of power. And here's where things get truly revealing. In order to justify ever-increasing budgets, the intelligence community has to be honest about where the money's thin, where gaps are growing, and where the system can't keep up. Paradoxically, acknowledging these weaknesses is the price of securing congressional funding. But these same admissions are read on the other side too, by those the report is meant to warn against. The irony is hard to miss. In the same breath that paints Russia as a resurgent threat, the document exposes the U.S. as stretched and anxious, chasing global commitments it struggles to sustain. So, what are we actually reading here? On one page, Russia is cast as a multi-regional power, adept at prioritizing, concentrating efforts on the Arctic, on nuclear modernization, on key strategic zones. On the next, the U.S. narrative is one of resource dilution, spreading thin across too many theaters, with mounting technological and institutional constraints. Two mirrors side by side. And the second reflection, the one about American overstretch, may be the more important, because these reports rarely lie about weakness. The cost of getting it wrong is simply too high. If you just skim the headlines, it's easy to see only the warning: Russia as the threat, the justification for bigger budgets and tougher policies. But if you read deeper, you see something else: the anxiety, the structural limits, the subtle admission that dominance is not guaranteed. Those with the patience to read between the lines will see that the real contest is not just about who has more hardware or the bigger budget, but about who can set real priorities and adapt to changing circumstances. Russia, by necessity or by design, is painted as knowing exactly where to focus and how to maneuver. The U.S., for all its power, is showing signs of strategic confusion, a system forced to confess its pressure points just to keep the money flowing. And here's what's truly at stake. The way these reports are framed doesn't just shape budgets. They influence policies, shift alliances, and set the tone for future conflicts or cooperation. If we accept the official narrative at face value, we risk missing the underlying story. A world where old certainties are slipping, where Arctic control and technological supremacy are no longer a given, and where misreading the signs could cost a country its influence, its money, and even its security. So, next time you see an official threat assessment, ask yourself, are you being warned, or are you being shown where the foundations are cracking? The answers you find might just reveal the next chapter in the global power game. What surprised you more, the way the U.S. describes Russia, or the way it describes itself? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely interested to see which side of the mirror caught your attention most. And if you want to keep unpacking these documents together, make sure to subscribe. There's another deep dive coming soon.